Listen closely, and you might hear the silence, the deep, resonant silence that holds the memory of a time long before the flags, the fences, and the frantic clamor of modern America. Our story does not begin with the arrival of ships from across the great ocean, but with the people who had lived beside this soil since the world began, the Cherokee. They called themselves Ani-Yunwia, the principal people. Their heartland was a sprawling, verdant empire across the Appalachian highlands, a landscape of misty mountains, crystalline rivers, and valleys so fertile they seemed kissed by the Creator himself. Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, Alabama, these modern lines meant nothing. This was simply home. Their civilization, unlike the nomadic tribes of the plains, was deeply rooted, highly structured, and profoundly spiritual. To the Europeans who arrived, fresh from their own enlightenment, the Cherokee were a revelation. They weren't savages dwelling in scattered chaos. They were a sophisticated society, a true nation. They had built communities of log cabins and raised livestock. They were expert farmers, mastering the art of cultivating corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters, which sustained their people both physically and spiritually. In the early 19th century, the Cherokee Nation proved their adaptability. They studied the ways of the newcomers, not out of weakness, but out of a desire for coexistence. They embraced Christianity, established schools, and even owned property, running prosperous plantations. But their greatest testament to civilization, the proof of their sovereign soul, lay in their institutions. In 1827, they drafted a written constitution, modeling it after that of the United States itself. It established a tripartite government, legislative, executive, and judicial branches. It was a beacon of self-government, a defiant declaration that they were not merely subjects, but citizens of a self-determined state. And there was Sequoyah, a man of quiet genius who had never learned to read English, yet invented a complete syllabary for the Cherokee language, 86 characters, each representing a syllable. Overnight, the Cherokee Nation became one of the most literate in the world. They founded their own newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, printed both in English and in Sequoyah's script, proclaiming their news and their rights to the world. This was the Golden Cradle, a nation flourishing, adapted, and ready to stand as an equal among the world's powers. They had earned the respect of many. They had proven their right to exist. But they had one fatal flaw. They possessed the land others desperately wanted. Chapter 2: The Glittering Curse. Sound. The hopeful music drops away abruptly, replaced by a low, ominous cello drone and the distant, excited chatter of men. Narrator. The year was 1828. A single shimmering discovery in the Cherokee territory of Georgia ignited a flame of greed that would consume the nation whole. The discovery was gold. Not just a few flakes, but a colossal deposit, sparking the first major gold rush in the history of the United States. Suddenly, the Cherokee land, which had been protected by treaties and affirmed by law, transformed from a recognized territory into an irresistibly desirable treasure chest. White prospectors, whom the Cherokee called intruders, swarmed the land like locusts. They trespassed, they looted, and they staked claims with brazen disregard for Cherokee sovereignty. The state of Georgia, fueled by this sudden wealth and driven by the deep-seated desire to remove all indigenous presence, began an aggressive legislative campaign. Georgia's reaction was not of restraint, but of brutal assertion. They passed a series of laws specifically designed to dismantle the Cherokee Nation from within. These laws were instruments of psychological warfare, stripping the Cherokee of every legal protection they possessed. Imagine a man standing in his own home, watching as the laws that govern his life
are rewritten by strangers solely to justify theft. The laws made it illegal for a Cherokee to testify against a white man in court. This was not merely discrimination, it was the ultimate license to steal, rape, and murder without fear of consequence. The laws further declared null and void all Cherokee laws and customs, even making it a crime for the Cherokee National Council to convene. The legal system, the very framework that gave their civilization structure, was systematically suffocated. The message was clear: you are no longer a nation, you are merely an obstacle. In the face of this systemic oppression stood Principal Chief John Ross, a man of mixed Scottish and Cherokee descent, highly educated, and possessing an unshakable faith in the American legal system and the sanctity of treaties. Ross became the voice of his people, battling not with guns or spears, but with paper and ink. He appealed to Congress, he wrote impassioned letters to the president, and he began the arduous, heartbreaking work of taking the fight all the way to the highest court in the land. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not determine the power of armies, but the power of conscience, of law, and of basic human decency. On one side, the Cherokee, armed with their treaties and the Constitution. On the other, the state of Georgia, backed by the political will of a nation consumed by expansion and the glittering curse of gold. This was the moment the promise of America began to crumble, revealing the dark foundation of injustice upon which it would be built.
The stage of history often features figures whose actions, driven by personal conviction, change the fate of entire peoples. In this tragedy, that figure was Andrew Jackson, the 7th President of the United States. His arrival in the White House was not just a political shift, it was a seismic event for every indigenous nation east of the Mississippi. Jackson was an imposing figure, a self-made military hero, revered by the common man, tough and utterly unyielding. He carried the scars of his life literally and figuratively. He was a product of the frontier, where his views on Native Americans were forged in relentless conflict and deep-seated prejudice. To him, the indigenous people were not sovereign neighbors, but stubborn impediments to American progress, obstacles that must be cleared for the march of civilization. He did not invent the idea of removal, but he gave it the force of federal law and presidential mandate. His ideology, often termed Jacksonian democracy, was fueled by two core beliefs: the absolute sovereignty of the Union and the supremacy of the white yeoman farmer. He saw the treaties signed by previous administrations not as sacred pacts, but as temporary inconveniences that must now be swept aside for the greater good of the expanding republic. He did not invent the idea of removal, but he gave it the force of federal law and presidential mandate. His ideology, often termed Jacksonian democracy, was fueled by two core beliefs: the absolute sovereignty of the Union and the supremacy of the white yeoman farmer. He saw the treaties signed by previous administrations not as sacred pacts, but as temporary inconveniences that must now be swept aside for the greater good of the expanding republic. Jackson addressed Congress with a fierce determination. His arguments were deceptively simple, cloaked in the language of benevolence. He argued that removal was not an act of cruelty, but one of compassion. That by moving the Cherokee and other tribes westward, they would be saved from the corrupting influence of the settlers and the destructive power of state laws. He painted a picture of a vast promised land in the West, where they could live unmolested and in peace. This was the core deception, claiming paternal protection while simultaneously enacting profound dispossession. He ignored the irony that the very settlers and state laws he claimed to protect the tribes from were emboldened by his own rhetoric and inaction.
The resulting legislative battle in Congress over the Indian Removal Act of 1830 was one of the most bitter and contentious debates in early American history. It was not a unanimous vote. Conscience fought vehemently against ambition. Powerful voices rose in opposition: missionaries, politicians like Davy Crockett, and humanitarians who recognized the profound immorality of the proposal. They argued that the nation's honor, its founding principle of respecting treaties, was at stake. They pleaded for justice. But the voices of expansion and state rights were louder, backed by Jackson's immense popularity and political maneuvering. On May 28, 1830, the act passed by a narrow margin. It was not a mandate for forced removal, technically. It merely authorized the president to negotiate treaties for land exchange. But the underlying intent, the political and military force ready to be wielded, was unmistakable. The Cherokee and their chief, John Ross, understood the devastating truth. The law had been weaponized. Their fight was no longer against local greed, but against the sovereign will of the American state, embodied by its unyielding president. They decided to fight back using the enemy's own rulebook. They would challenge the president in the highest court of the land. Chapter 4: The Legal Battle and the Broken Promise. Narrator: The Supreme Court of the United States became the last refuge of the Cherokee Nation. Chief John Ross and his legal counsel, William Wirt, launched a brilliant, high-stakes legal campaign, hoping that American justice would honor American law, even if American politics would not. Their first case, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, 1831, was an attempt to invoke the court's original jurisdiction, arguing that the Cherokee Nation was a foreign state whose territorial rights were being violated by the state of Georgia. The ruling, delivered by Chief Justice John Marshall, was complex and heartbreaking. Marshall determined that the Cherokee Nation was not a foreign state in the constitutional sense, but rather a domestic dependent nation, a nation within a nation. This classification was devastating. It meant the court could not rule on the case directly. While Marshall acknowledged the fundamental rights of the Cherokee, the technicality meant their plea was dismissed. It was a legal victory for the white man structure, but a moral defeat for the concept of justice. The setback was crushing, but the fight was not over. The Cherokee legal team immediately pursued a second, more strategic case, Worcester versus Georgia, 1832. This case centered on Samuel Worcester, a white missionary and friend of the Cherokee, who had been arrested by Georgia for residing in the Cherokee territory without the required state license, a direct violation of a federal treaty. The stakes were higher. The question was clear: did the laws of Georgia or the treaties of the federal government hold supremacy? On March 3, 1832, Chief Justice Marshall delivered a powerful and unambiguous verdict. He declared the Georgia laws unconstitutional, asserting unequivocally that the Cherokee Nation possessed inherent sovereignty, and the state of Georgia had no right to legislate within their territory. Treaties, he concluded, were the supreme law of the land, and the federal government alone, not the states, had jurisdiction over the Cherokee. The Cherokee Nation had won, a resounding, categorical victory delivered by the highest judicial authority in the nation. Joy and relief briefly swept through the Cherokee camps. Justice, it seemed, had prevailed. But judicial victory is meaningless without executive enforcement. When the news reached the White House, President Andrew Jackson's reaction was legendary in its defiance and its callous disregard for the rule of law. It is widely reported that Jackson remarked, with contemptuous dismissal, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." With that single arrogant sentence, Jackson shattered the separation of powers and unilaterally rendered the Supreme Court verdict irrelevant. He signaled to Georgia and to the military that the president would not uphold the law of the land. The judicial branch had spoken, but the executive branch had betrayed the Constitution. The broken promise was not merely to the Cherokee, it was a promise to the foundational integrity of the United States government itself. The law had been established as a shield for the oppressed, only to be tossed aside by the very man sworn to protect it. The path of legal resistance had reached a dead end. The only remaining paths were desperate flight or military subjugation. The stage was now set for the final tragic act.
The tragedy of the winter lay not just in the cold, but in the indifference of those in power. While the Cherokee froze, their supplies dwindled, and their meager rations were often stolen or sold for profit by corrupt officials. The military escorts, though sometimes showing moments of kindness, were primarily concerned with keeping the pace and preventing escape. Their humanity was often overridden by the military mandate of the removal. The records kept by the few sympathetic military doctors and observers are harrowing. They speak of mothers burying multiple children in the space of a single week, of men driven mad by grief and exhaustion, of the sheer, relentless sight of death that became a constant companion along the road. One recorded account describes the detachment stopping merely to dig graves, not to rest or eat. The trail was marked not by milestones, but by mounds of freshly turned earth. The winter did more than just kill. It systematically destroyed the Cherokee social fabric. Traditional rites and mourning rituals were impossible. A people who revered their ancestors and their burial customs were forced to abandon their dead hastily, robbing them of the comfort of proper farewells. This spiritual violation was, for many, a suffering deeper than the physical pain. As the icy ordeal continued, many detachments had to halt entirely, seeking any form of temporary shelter. They crammed into abandoned farm buildings, caves, or beneath thick stands of trees, only to face further starvation as they could not hunt or forage in the snow. The constant illness meant that even when they had the strength, they lacked the time to help the sick, leading to a vicious cycle of disease and death. The Trail of Tears was a calculated cruelty, where the elements were merely the executors of a policy forged in political ambition and economic greed. The winter solidified the memory of the journey not as a mere removal, but as a deliberate act of genocide through neglect and exposure. Chapter 9: The Invisible Scars. The wind fades, replaced by the persistent, muffled sound of quiet sobbing. A profound, lasting silence. Narrator. By late March 1839, the final detachments staggered across the border into what would become Oklahoma, the designated Indian Territory. They had survived the impossible, but they arrived broken. The Cherokee nation that stepped onto the new land was fundamentally changed. The loss was quantifiable: 4,000 souls, a quarter of their people. But the wounds that truly mattered were the invisible ones. The psychological damage was immense. Survivors carried the deep burden of guilt for those they could not save, the haunting images of bodies left unburied, and the profound trauma of witnessing their entire civilization dismantled. The family structure, the core unit of Cherokee society, had been fractured. Children were orphaned, spouses were separated, and entire lines of hereditary knowledge were extinguished with the death of the elders. They arrived in a territory that was unfamiliar, often hostile, and already home to other tribes who resented the sudden intrusion. The internal political divisions that had led to the Treaty of New Echota now exploded. The majority faction, led by Chief Ross, viewed the members of the treaty party, those who signed the fraudulent agreement, as traitors responsible for the catastrophe. This lingering resentment poisoned their new beginnings, leading quickly to tragic acts of revenge and bloodshed in the West. Sound,
A low, tense drumbeat begins, symbolizing conflict. Narrator: the immediate task was survival. The survivors had to clear land, build new shelters, and establish farms, all while grieving their colossal losses and battling internal strife. They had been promised fertile land and provisions by the U.S. government. These promises, like the treaties before them, were often broken or delivered late, forcing the weakened survivors into further months of famine and hardship. The experience had created an indelible scar, a collective memory of betrayal and suffering that transcended any individual life. The Trail of Tears was not a chapter that could be closed. It was a permanent, defining feature of their identity. It taught them a devastating lesson: that no amount of assimilation, no legal victory, and no solemn treaty could protect them from the relentless, overwhelming power of American expansionism backed by military force. The winter of the soul had ended physically, but its shadow would forever fall across the future of the Cherokee Nation.
The arrival in the West, in the designated Indian Territory, now Oklahoma, was not an ending, but a new, profoundly difficult beginning. The survivors of the Trail of Tears stumbled onto a landscape that was entirely alien to the lush, familiar hills of the Appalachian heartland. This was prairie country, drier, rockier, and offering few of the familiar resources they had relied upon for generations. They arrived not as conquerors or pioneers, but as refugees, exhausted and deeply traumatized. The immediate challenges were overwhelming. They needed shelter, food, and medicine, none of which were readily available. The meager supplies promised by the U.S. government were often delayed, spoiled, or woefully insufficient for the thousands of famished and disease-ridden people. The first months in the new territory were almost as deadly as the march itself, an era known as the starving time. Weakened by the journey, many more succumbed to illness and hunger. Furthermore, the territory was not empty. It was already home to other tribes who had been removed earlier, like the Choctaw and Creek, who often viewed the newly arrived Cherokee with suspicion and resentment. The Cherokees had to navigate not only the harsh environment, but also the complex, often hostile politics of intertribal relations in this confined new space. Sound. A tense, low, single-string instrument plays a melancholic tune. Narrator. But the Cherokee spirit, though battered, was not broken. Their resilience, forged in the fire of suffering, began to assert itself. Under the unwavering leadership of Principal Chief John Ross, who himself had endured the Trail of Tears, the nation slowly began the monumental task of reconstruction. The first act was political, yet tragically violent. The simmering bitterness between the vast majority who followed Ross and the small group who signed the fraudulent Treaty of New Echota, the Treaty Party, erupted into bloodshed. The consensus among the survivors was that the signers were traitors responsible for the death of 4,000 people. In June 1839, Major Ridge, his son John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot, key figures of the Treaty Party, were assassinated by members of the majority faction. This act, though born of immense grief and perceived justice, threatened to plunge the fragile new nation into civil war. Ross, using all his diplomatic skill, eventually managed to bring the factions together. In 1839, the Cherokee Nation drafted a new constitution in the West, formally unifying the old settlers, those who had moved earlier, and the new arrivals. The capital was established at Tahlequah, and the work of rebuilding their institutions, their courts, their schools, and their legislature began anew. They were forced to relearn farming on unfamiliar ground. They reconstructed their political institutions from scratch. They founded new schools, ensuring that the legacy of Sequoyah syllabary would live on. The determination to recreate their civilization, their commitment to law and education, proved stronger than the forces that had tried to destroy them. The golden cradle was gone,
but the seed of their identity had been successfully replanted, watered by tears and blood. Chapter 11. The Echoes and the Legacy. Sound. The melancholy tune swells briefly, then settles into a quiet, reverent tone. Narrator. 2 centuries have passed since the Indian Removal Act, but the Trail of Tears remains an open wound in the American historical landscape. It is not merely a story of forced migration. It is a profound national parable about the collision between civilization and avarice, between law and executive tyranny. The legacy of the trail is manifold. First, it is a testament to the brutal efficiency of racial removal as a tool of American expansion. It created vast tracts of land for white settlement and cotton agriculture, directly fueling the economic engine of the southern states and entrenching the institution of slavery. The tragedy of the Cherokee was interwoven with the tragedy of the enslaved Africans. Both were victims of the same hunger for land and wealth. Second, it permanently damaged the integrity of U.S. treaties. The American government demonstrated that treaties were merely temporary expedients, disposable when they conflicted with political or economic interest. This betrayal shattered trust and undermined future negotiations with all Native American tribes. Sound. A soft, sustained chord on a piano or church organ. Narrator. But the most enduring legacy belongs to the survivors. It is the legacy of perseverance. The Cherokee Nation today is one of the largest and most successful tribal governments in the United States, a testament to the spirit that refused to die on that frozen, heartbreaking trail. They rebuilt their economy, revitalized their language, and continue to assert their sovereignty, never forgetting the cost paid for the land they now inhabit. When we speak of the Trail of Tears, we are not just reciting history, we are bearing witness. We remember the names of the 4,000 lost souls. We recall the arrogance of Jackson's defiance and the fragility of the rule of law when faced with prejudice and power. We acknowledge the invisible scars carried by the descendants, the deep-seated knowledge of ancestral trauma. The Trail of Tears is the solemn reminder that the history of this great nation is stained with moments of profound injustice. To truly honor the principles of liberty and justice for all, we must first look unflinchingly at the darkest paths taken. The lament of the stolen land is an echo that must never fade, serving as a perpetual guard against the forces of greed and intolerance.